Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Debra and Peter Are Doing a Podcast. We are back after 3 weeks break from podcasting. During that time, I have re-become a president. I have become a chair. I have been on a lad's few days to Amsterdam.
Wow.
What could possibly go wrong there? And all sorts of other things to report. But Debra, you've actually had a proper holiday. And I must say that the little story, which I'd love you to retell, that you popped up on LinkedIn about your trip to the Corfu tourist shop, really made me laugh out loud. So how was your holiday? And just do recount that story again.
It was lovely, Peter, apart from, this one particular incident, which, made me absolutely outraged. And it was Crete, in fact, not Corfu.
Oh, Crete, sorry.
Yeah, so I was there for just a week. It wasn't particularly long, but, a full 7 days, which was lovely. And it was one particular evening, so we were with two friends of ours who are two big blokes, they're over 6 foot, 6'2" really, and not fat, but very large, fellas. And they spotted a shop that was selling Frida Kahlo themed embroidered cushions. And they really loved the look of these cushions. So that was on the Tuesday. So on the Wednesday, we went back to the shop so that they could buy said cushions. But they were ahead of us. So Andy and I, my partner, we were on the other side of the road. Anyway, the shopkeeper was delighted to see them and recognised them. And our pal said, wow, that's really impressive that you recognised us. And he said, that's because you're not my usual clientele. To which they said, well, what's your usual clientele? And he said, it's normally little old ladies who want to look at the lace tablecloths. Anyway, all this conversation was going on unbeknownst to me. Andy and I then, get to the shop. And as soon as I walk in, the shopkeeper pounces on me and says, would you like to come into the shop and look at our lace tablecloths? and I didn't find out till afterwards when Andy and Simon said what had happened. I was absolutely outraged. But of course, stupidly, I was like, I was then all like, do I really look like a little old lady? Is this how bad things have got? And my pal said, it could be your stick, because obviously I have to use a walking stick. And so the next day, sheer vanity made me refuse point blank to use my stick. So I hobbled around the town, and anyway, bitterly regretted it, because by the end of the evening, my hip was absolutely killing me, and it was agony the next day as well. So vanity caused me pain, so I didn't get any sympathy for that. But I was so upset, and I haven't forgotten it. It's like seared in my soul.
Well, you are quite little, and you are a lady. So
well, I'm not sure about that.
It's the age thing that has done it for you, I think. There,
yes.
And it comes to us all.
I know, so funny, but it was a good holiday. But actually, it was so that, I got back from holiday on the Wednesday, and on the Thursday, I had to go up to Leeds to give a keynote speech to the Yorkshire Funders, and it was quite fun actually, because I developed a swelling in my foot, an arthritic swelling, which meant that I was planning to drive, but I couldn't because I couldn't walk properly, so I had to go on a train. And this trip to Leeds took me 6 taxis, 4 trains, and 6 kilometres worth of hobbling on a swollen foot and a bad hip. So it was quite a hike to get there on a really, really hot day as well. I think it was about 32 degrees or something. But it was great. I really enjoyed it. Although what was funny was sat on the train revisiting my notes. Of course, I'd written the speech about 3 or 4 weeks before, because I knew I was going to be away and I wouldn't have time to do it when I got back. So I was well prepared. When I looked at the speech on the train on the way up to Leeds, I was like, this is shit. This is absolutely rubbish. I have no idea what point I'm trying to make. It looks really dull and boring. I was like, oh no. Anyway, with no means to rebut. Anyway, I turned up and told them, the truth, and said, look, this may not turn out quite the way I was hoping, but let's give it a go. But it went really well, because I was obviously off script most of the time, which, to be honest, I usually am, Peter. I mean, I often write, as you will know, because you've heard me speak before. I prepare all this, I prepare my notes really carefully and practice. And then on the day, I almost never deliver what I've written, because something pops into my head, or, halfway through saying something else occurs to me. But it was great. There were great people, and there were loads of them in the room. I reckon there must have been 80, 100 funders in the room talking about specifically funding Yorkshire. I'm pretty sure one of your old colleagues at the Lottery Fund was there too.
I love Leeds. I was a Leeds student.
Oh, were you?
Yeah, I was a year behind Keir Starmer. Although I was on the student council, he was never on the student council, so far as I can remember. He was obviously keeping his head down. And I remember having one of my most. Someone once said to me, "What's the best day of your life?" This was before I had got married, of course.
Obviously, of course.
And one day I went to watch Yorkshire play Somerset in the county championship at Headingley. And then in the evening I went to see the Sisters of Mercy play at the university. And I remember thinking, what could be better than watching cricket and going to a gig, seeing a Leeds band? And, life was at its absolute pinnacle then. So I've got lots of fond memories of Leeds.
Oh, I hadn't realised you'd gone to Leeds. No, Leeds is great. And, Yorkshire folk are fabulous. One of the things we were talking about was, or I was talking about was, the power of funders' voices. I was saying to them, if you ring up the local authority and say, we need to talk about this issue of poverty or mental health or, limited access to resources or something in our area, they will listen to you because they know you're not asking for money, and you've got so much information because of all the different charities that you fund. You can see that there's a charity over here that you're funding to do, work with mental health in young people. There's a charity over here that you can see is trying to support families in poverty, and these things are linked. And, often the charities themselves aren't linked, but you can be a link for them. And actually that went down really well. I got quite a lot of comments afterwards about, you're right. We do need to use our voices more. But it's always been a source of sort of puzzlement to me about why funders don't speak out more. I mean, I've been thinking about I guess some of it is fear. There are quite a lot of trustees who don't want to rock the boat and don't want to, they don't want their organisation to be seen as woke or activists or things like that. I suspect some of it might also be modesty. Quite a lot of people say to me, well, we don't believe we're the experts, and so we'd be very reluctant to speak out. I think some of it's, probably capacity, because there's always assumption that, grant givers with lots of money have lots of staff, and actually the opposite is usually true. There are 10, 20, 30 million pound endowed charities that employ maybe 4 people, if that. So I think some of it's that. But, you've worked in the funding world. I know it's the lottery, so it's slightly a different funding model. But what's your view about why they don't speak out?
I mean, it's a great question. And I'm not sure. I mean, in the case of the lottery, the lottery is a quango, a non-governmental public body. It's subject to government directions. It does have to be careful, and I tried really hard, and I'm sure current management will be trying really hard to position it as an intelligent funder that is very much at arm's length from government and doing what it thinks is best. But ultimately, there is definitely careful about biting the hand that feeds you factor to play there. But the government was always very interested in what we were knowing and understanding and learning from our funding. And there were major programs of funding, like all the money that went into children's play, for example, healthy living centres, that was generating insight and understanding to inform wider government policy. And we did used to have behind the scenes some interesting meetings with civil servants and ministers, which you wouldn't appreciate in the outside world, because we weren't kind of banging the drum and campaigning and agitating for change. We were part of that kind of informed conversation about issues, and I think that where all of that came together with the NSPCC and the Better Start program, again, I think there's some really interesting work that funders have done in that space, which is known and recognised and is helping inform the debate about what works in the first 1,001 days. But I think probably, some of these smaller, edgier funders don't appreciate the knowledge and perspective that they have, and the power that could have. Right, they think of themselves as slightly kind of trivial or small in the overall scheme of things, but actually what they are supporting and learning from those investments or disbursements is fascinating and of great interest to public policymakers. So I could only encourage them, as you were doing, I think, really, to whether and you might choose to do it in a very
quiet
public
way,
amplified way, or you can do it quietly if you know the right people, and there are those many of us who can put the right people in touch.
There's
a lot to learn.
It did go down well. In fact, somebody messaged me afterwards and said, I feel a march on Whitehall coming up with a load of funders, banging on the door of number 10, which was delightful. But actually, it was quite interesting as well, because one of the other things we were talking about was about, this kind of push for impact, which really, really pisses me off and wears me down. It's like, it's just such a fashionable thing to say, like, we need to demonstrate our impact. And I was saying that part of the problem is that lots and lots of the funding that you will do, the impact's not going to be felt for years. I don't know, have we spoken about this before, Peter? Was it Homestart or Sure Start? I can't remember which start it was. I think it was Homestart, was it, that then got closed down? Or was it Sure Start?
Sure Start's the early years children's centres.
That's right, yeah. So Sure Start, that was it. So I always get confused between the two. And they've just done a longitudinal study on the effect. Yeah, exactly, which says that it was massively successful and impactful. But it was only because they were looking at, the results 20 years on, like what had happened to the young people, etc. And that was the point I was making. I was using that example and saying the reality is that transformational funding, you are not going to see an impact in a year, 2 years, or 3 years. In fact, you're very unlikely to, because these are entrenched societal problems which take a long time to turn around. And so I was saying to maybe shift your thinking from transactional short-term funding, which is projects where you can have a bit of money for a year or for that particular post, and start thinking about, can you do transformational funding where, you're investing in something that in the long term is going to produce reactions. And I was a bit nervous about saying that, because I thought, I know that, people can be very precious about, we want to fund projects and stuff. But actually, again, the response was very, very positive, and somebody said to me, I'd never, ever considered that what we were doing as transactional funding and what we could be doing as transformational funding. And that's a conversation we ought to be having on our board. So I felt very pleased with how it had gone, but I think mostly because they were very, very receptive, very open, very energetic, really inspiring group of people. So it was a joy despite all the travel woes and the rest of it, it was an absolute joy to spend my time up there.
That's
and in
brilliant.
fact, to be honest, when I'm asked to go up north, I always try and say yes, because I'm very conscious that, they feel very much that those of us who are, based in the south and particularly around the London area, we get all the speakers and all the attention, and people aren't prepared to go. But I was prepared to do a 4.5, 5 hour trip there and about the same back for an hour's session, because I think it's important. I think it's worth it. And you used to do that, of course, when you were chief exec of the lottery. You used to scootle around the country, didn't you?
Yeah, I got slagged off for it. It was there was a Telegraph expose on my travel expenses, which it was lovely when the sector said, well, we'd rather have someone that comes out to see us than someone that sits in his office all day. That was a lovely moment. But some people, Debra, would say that Leeds is the Midlands, and that it really shouldn't take you 4 to 4.5 hours to get there. And actually, you're going barely scratching the surface of the north, going to Leeds, which is a pretty prosperous city anyway. But those occasions are great, aren't they, for giving energy and and again, smaller trusts and foundations, and feeling that you're kind of battling away and doing a little thing in your space. When you see what other people are up to, or real sense of energy and purpose about, I am part of something bigger and greater, and in our own little ways together we will all make the country a much better place than would otherwise be. So
and I was saying
really
about
good.
collaborating as well, like I said, one of the things I suggested was, have you ever sat in a room together as a group of funders? Because some of them are national funders who are also funding in Yorkshire, and some are local funders. But have you ever sat in a room together and just like with no agenda, and just talked about the issues that are facing Yorkshire and how you can work together to make connections. And again, that was something they like. So they do to a certain degree, but it was like reminding them of the value of your network, value of collaboratively funding and having discussions and conversations. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Very good. Can't beat getting out of the southeast, which is my other major project at the moment.
Oh yeah.
Project Relocate to the West Country to bring my heart and my head and my home into synchronized life is really taking shape and taking pace now. So I'm feeling that before very long, I might be coming to you properly from the Somerset area rather than having a Taunton poster up behind me. So that's filling my head as much as anything else at the moment.
So thinking about how okay, do we, Peter, the mighty move?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of due diligence and solicitors talking to solicitors, as is always the case. But we're starting getting into some of the more practical logistic questions now of how do we get 3 people and 4 cats 175 miles, which starts with a trip down a unreconstructed bridleway, which we live at the end of at one end, and through some very narrow gates at the other end, where the road to the village we're moving to is for the next 6 to 8 weeks closed for major gas repairs. But these are all simple problems that we'll address in sequence. So you can do it with a Gantt chart and a decent project plan. Anything's possible. That's what I'm telling myself. Still feels simpler than running a charity.
Well, your project management leadership skills that you've learned over the years, Peter, super come in handy when you're trying to do personal stuff, don't they?
They're going to have to.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to talk about was we have, so as and possibly listeners will know, is that DSE is a fully remote organisation. So we've got staff scattered all over the country. And once a year, we come together, the whole organisation, into a space in London, usually, because that's typically the easiest place for everybody to get to. Given we have people in Kent, in Cornwall, in North Wales, etc. And the day is organised completely by the staff. So it's not imposed on the staff by the leadership team. And we obviously have parameters which say it needs to be a day of fun and connection, but also preferably some kind of learning or enrichment, so we all can do some part of our jobs a little bit better. But other than that, we don't typically interfere. And they put together a really great day, which was we had a whole thing on unconscious bias. So Peter, every year we do some kind of a quiz, and it's usually a quiz that helps us with general knowledge about stuff, particularly to do with our sector or our work. But I usually win because I've been around such a long time. The team I'm on usually win. So the staff approached the all-star team apparently and said, please can you not let Debra be in the quiz this year, because we all give up the moment we see which team she's in. So they made me run the quiz. So I had to do it with Harry, on the grounds that's the only way they can stop me winning, which was very funny, really made me laugh. But actually what we did, because you and I both absolutely love House of Games, don't we? And so what I did is I took the averages idea, and basically I had 12 questions about the wider charity sector. So questions like, so each team, the closest person to the true figure would win. And so questions like, what's the size of the contribution to the UK economy, which is about 96 billion, how many staff are there, about 1.2 million, how many trustees, all that across the sector as a whole. And it was great because it didn't really matter that most people didn't know, apart from obviously my director of research and policy, who mostly knew, so his team did win. But what was really great fun was listening to the discussions, like, well, I know volunteering numbers have gone down, so it can't be that many anymore. How many do you think it is? And, does it count if they're not registered with the charity? And, it was just really, really getting them to think about these numbers and these figures. So it was great fun. It was a really great day. But it always makes me laugh with all staff days is how you're always terribly shocked to see what people look like in real life. And because we only meet in real life once a year, because of course on screen we all look the same size, don't we? Whereas of course so I always forget that our colleague Stuart is about 6'5". He's like a giant beanpole, and yet you'd never, and because he's got a slim face, you would never think that. when you see him on the screen, and then others who, you suddenly think, gosh, I hadn't realized how utterly tiny you are. So it was joyful to be together. It really, really was. And the weather was quite nice. But actually, we're so lucky, of course, because as a small organisation, which we are, we're only about 30 staff, I think. It's actually easy for us all to come together as one team. And I actually really feel for very big organisations that employ hundreds or thousands of staff, is because I guess you can never, ever have an organisation-wide get together. I mean, I suppose theoretically you could do it online, but it would cost so much money to do it all together. I mean, how did you manage it at NSPCC? Yeah. Did you have staff days like that? Or?
I remember thinking that was difficult and bemoaning how hard it was to bring people together and get a common kind of culture across an organisation that had 1,500 people, and saying that in one of these kind of action learning set discussions with leaders from different organisations. And someone who was in the group from Standard Chartered Bank told me to get a grip, because he said that they were working in 28 countries and their staff survey was translated in 7 different languages. So if I thought it was difficult, then it was really difficult for them. So there's definitely different techniques for different scale organisations, aren't there? And you have to bring your leaders together at different levels, and also accept there are, I think, going to be some subcultures within a large organization. One of the things that I did towards my later years at the NSPCC was meet on a reasonably regular basis everyone who reported to the people who reported to me. So if I had 7 or 8 people reporting to me and they all had 5 or 6 reporting to them, it meant there was sort of 60 or 70 individuals who I would check in with once or twice a year. And that's a massive dedication of time. And I remember saying to my chair, is it okay, I'm going to meet 65 people for half an hour, so that's 32 and a half hours of my time I'm devoted to this. And he says, well, it's not, it's 65 hours, because if you're going to do it, I expect you to prepare properly for each of the half hours. Which was a fair point. But one of the things that did was it does allow you to create a consistent set of expectations and access to you as well. And in larger organizations, it's not enough just to say, my door is always open.
Because nobody's going to walk in it.
Well, some people will, and they'll definitely take advantage, and others absolutely won't. And I'm not one of those people who, if the chief executive said that, would be rushing to knock the door down. And there are certain functions in the organization which the chief executive is much more likely to bump into than others. So by creating that consistency of access and consistency of expectation, and using those half-hour slots to convey similar messages, I think that's a way of creating a common culture. But bringing everyone together, much more difficult. I think it's going to be one of the supremely interesting and challenging issues for organizations of all sizes, actually, in the coming period, about what it means to be certainly hybrid working, if not home working, because there are definitely different attitudes and expectations to the value of bringing people together in person, aren't there? And some people will really will miss out if they don't have any direct access to other people. And if your contract says that you are 1 day a week in the office or 2 days a week in the office, what does that mean? Does it mean that you pitch up on a Friday when no one else is there and you work exactly the same way as you would at home? Or does it mean that things are configured so that your team come together and you can bounce ideas off one another and do development with one another, and the logistics of all of that. In a way, I feel I was fortunate as a leader in that it was through the lockdown and just out the other side where we were all playing at it, and it felt extremely kind of liberating, and we gave people space to work through their own preferences within reason. But at some point, I think you do have to look at the learning and development of your staff cadre as a whole and say, where are we going to be tight and where are we going to be loose on these things?
Because I've always found it most peculiar, so there are some organisations who say you have to come into the office 2 or 3 days a week, but you can choose the day. And I'm always like, but what's the point of that? Because, as you quite rightly say, because you'll end up with members of staff who come in on a day when the rest of their team isn't in, and you're right, they still spend the day staring at a screen plugged into there. And so for me, if that's what you're saying, that always smacks me just a bit of power. Like, I can make you come in, and therefore that's what I'm going to do. There are other organisations who I think do it more cleverly, who say, like, you have to come in 1 day a week, but everybody has to come in on that 1 day, and during that day we will do the core meetings or the staff training or the whatever, and that I can understand. But this sort of random, I'm going to force you to come into the office just because we've got an office, just has never ever made any sense to me. And we've spoken about remote working before, Peter, haven't we? But the other thing about it works so well at DSC, it's so blooming successful, I can't even tell you. But that's because we completely changed the way in which we work. We didn't assume that it's just a question of doing exactly what you would do in your office desk from your home, because it doesn't work like that, because you've got to create. You've got to really be effortful and purposeful about creating opportunities for casual, informal conversations, for people to feel connected and stuff like that. And I think, again, that's where organisations for whom it doesn't work, it's normally because they haven't really properly, purposefully, intentionally thought about what will we lose by being remote, and how can we effectively compensate for that in our practices. But it doesn't work for everybody, huh?
Yeah, if you go all in and don't have a HQ at all, then you can ask yourself those questions in a pretty kind of fundamental way, can't you? If you do have places where you want and need to bring people together from time to time, and there are many organisations where you need people present to deliver face-to-face,
of course, absolutely,
services of one kind or another, and all the rest of it. But then it's you quite quickly get into an incredibly kind of bureaucratic process of, these people are going to work on Tuesdays, these people are going to work on every other Wednesday. And then you find yourself renting or owning a huge building, which is only ever 50% full, and lots of people feeling that they're working on the days when they really don't need to work. But if you don't plan it sufficiently far ahead, how can people organise their childcare, their travel? Exactly. I think this is it's an interesting one, and again, looking forward to see how people solve it, and rather grateful that I'm not responsible for
my advice
quite that way.
My advice always is, firstly, be purposeful. Think about what you want to retain in terms of culture and working practices, and secondly, ask the staff. I mean, when we implemented our remote working at DSC, we didn't sit as a directors team or a management team and decide how it was going to work. We asked them how it was going to work. Like, this is what we're going to be doing. How can we make it work? And so almost everything we do is something they said we should do to make it better. And I think, again, leaders very often think they've got to have the answer to all this. And I pretty much all the time I say, don't try and solve the problems that are going to be presented by changing the way you work. Go back to the staff and say, how do you want to make this work? How can we make this work? And they will always come up with much, much better solutions than we ever can, because they're doing the job, No,
that's very true. Now, I've got one other final story to share with you from my memory, which draws together Yorkshire and your competitive nature in quizzes, because you've brought back to me memory of a bed and breakfasting tour holiday I went on with a former girlfriend. And anyway, we pitched up in this village, and there was a pub quiz. So I said, we've got to go and do the pub quiz. We've got to do the pub quiz. But what about dinner? I said, we'll have dinner later. But let's go and do the quiz. So we went and did the quiz, and we definitely looked like soft Southerners in a very kind of Yorkshire gritty pub with many competitive quiz teams, and did extremely well. And the prize for winning the quiz was a crate of John Smith's beer.
Okay.
And our little team of two, we were joint winners of the quiz. And I thought, if we win this quiz, I'm not going to get out of here alive with a crate of John Smith's beer. So there was a playoff eliminator question, and I knew the answer, and I deliberately failed to give the answer. So we came second, got 4 cans of John Smith's, left the pub, and everything else in the village in the meantime had closed down. So there's nowhere to go for dinner. So dinner was 2 cans of John Smith's each, and the relationship didn't last much longer beyond that.
I can see why, Peter. I can see why. That's a really funny story.
So there you go. That's it, I think, for this week's episode.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Thank you, and lovely to see you again.
And did you bring any embroidery back with you?
No, I didn't bring any cushions.
No,
that wasn't for me. No, although I did bring back some beautiful carved wood resin coasters and a table mat.
Okay. Oh, well, that's good. And I brought an Ajax scarf back from Amsterdam. So there we are.
We've all got our souvenirs. Okay.
Great.
Thanks for listening, folk.
See you next time.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.